It took me some time to decide to write all of this because this story has multiple parts that may or may not be connected. It may be a bit long and a bit anticlimactic, as it's not as creepy or traumatic as other stories, but it took me weeks to sleep well again since Ronaldo Caruti came knocking on my door. Here's the context. I live on a small dirt road in southern Ohio, which sounds rural and agricultural, but it's right next to a subsidized apartment complex and a main road in the area. It's a strange mix of transient people and long-term residents, young families and solitary individuals. One house might be meticulously cared for and maintained, while the neighboring house might have a jet ski in the yard and a tree wrapped in chicken wire as an improvised cage for their parrot. This isn't a random example. It's something real. I've lived here for almost 10 years, and for more than 9 of those years, it's just been my daughter and me. She's 10 years old now, but I still don't like letting her play alone in the yard, and I'm obsessive about keeping the doors locked and double-bolted at all times, even when we're just relaxing at home. I'm someone who prefers to be alone. I don't ask questions or cause trouble. My main goal in life is to be left alone. And then Tadeo moved in. Imagine the neighborhood is laid out like a 4-step staircase. I live on the 3rd step, and if you go from left to right, you reach a row that leads to the aforementioned main road and out of the neighborhood. Tadeo moved into a house near one of these exits, just a few houses down the street on the opposite side, which I had no idea about until I was in my yard one day a few years ago, and a passing car stopped, and the window rolled down. Now I've had shady experiences with scammers and salespeople in the neighborhood before. There's a whole story about a group that tried to convince me to get into their car and withdraw money from an ATM for them, so I'm very skeptical and suspicious of any stranger who wants to stop and chat. Besides, I had never seen this guy before. Burly with salt and pepper hair, heavy eyes, and probably in his 50s at least. I was 26 at the time, so he had to be at least twice my age. So Tadeo slows down the car and rolls down the passenger window. He says something, but I can't hear him, so I take a hesitant step toward the vehicle, hoping he's just asking for directions. "Hi, girl," he says, and all my instincts immediately go on high alert because of how slimy he says the word girl. "I'm Tadeo, I just moved down the street," he says. I'm taken aback. "Okay. What's your name, honey?" Now, being called honey is usually a sure way to infuriate me, but there was something about him even in those first moments that set off all the alarms. Sometimes it's no big deal to tell a creepy guy to go to hell, but other times there's an inner voice that says, "This one's a ticking time bomb. Don't set him off." So I tell him my name, hoping he's just being friendly because, hey, maybe he's a nice grandpa who hasn't gotten the memo about not using girl and honey. This is the Southern Appalachians. He wouldn't be the only one. "Do you have a boyfriend?" I think every woman has that little "oh God" moment whenever a stranger asks this question. I'm so stunned and still trying to make sense of the interaction that I just say something negative because it's true. I don't have a boyfriend for a good reason. I'm gay. But at that time in my life, that was still private information, and I didn't feel obliged or inclined to share that detail with him. "You should let me take you out sometime," he says. "We can grab some beers." At this point, my skin is crawling, and I decline as politely as I can. He insists, and the interaction seems to last forever. But I guess it was about 10 or 15 minutes because I managed to back away to my door and make an excuse to go back inside. I hoped that would be the last time I had to talk to Tadeo, but of course it wasn't. For weeks, it seemed like every time I left the house, there was Tadeo in his car, slowing down to talk to me about this or that, but mostly trying to convince me to go out with him. "When are we going to dinner?" I always said no as politely as I could. It was annoying and stressful, but manageable. And then it escalated. I'm sitting at home one day and there's a knock on my door. I don't have a peephole or any way to see who's at the door without fully peeking out the front window, so I usually don't answer the door unless I'm expecting someone. If it's someone I know, they'll call me on the phone or announce themselves at the door. So I let the knocks continue, and then the doorbell rings, and then more knocking and more knocking and more knocking. Finally, I think maybe the neighbor's house is on fire or something. I open the door. Of course, it's Tadeo. "Hi, girl," he says with a sinister smile that never reaches his eyes. I want to tell him to go to hell, but more than ever, my instincts tell me not to make him angry. He clearly has no fear of crossing a boundary and lives basically just 2 or 3 houses away. All I can imagine is him going home, stewing over my insults, my rejection, and then only having to walk 2 minutes to take revenge. So I make the conversation as short as possible, politely decline all his proposals, and double lock the door as quickly as possible once he's gone. He starts showing up at least once a day, and I stop answering the door. He persists with the knocking, pounding angrily on the door when I don't answer. But I'm not going to voluntarily engage with this guy in any way. One day I'm sitting on the floor of my living room working on something, and the knocking starts. I ignore it. It becomes more insistent and angry. He calls my name, but he can't prove I'm home, so screw him. And then he tries to open the door. I always double lock the door, thank God, but the actual doorknob is usually just locked with the basic lock. I was sitting right there, less than a meter from the door, when I saw and heard it violently turn. If it hadn't been double locked, he would have walked right in and found me sitting on the floor. I probably should have called the police, but I had never called the police on anyone before. It seemed so extreme. He left soon after, and I let it go. How stupid. Another day I'm outside mowing the lawn with headphones on when I look up and there's Tadeo. I can't escape this guy, and it's starting to make me feel absolutely trapped. Of course, he wants to talk, and because I was a non-confrontational idiot at that time, I stop mowing the lawn and take off the headphones. He tells me he can help me with the lawn. A pretty girl like me shouldn't have to mow her own lawn. I just have to ask for his help. He tells me how he helps Eric all the time. Eric lives 2 houses down from me, almost directly across from Tadeo, and Eric is a constant, habitual public drunk. He doesn't bother anyone. He just staggers around his yard, sits on the couch in his driveway, and feeds the stray cats, which is problematic because it means we have a growing population of half-crazy feral cats running around. But I get it. I'm an animal lover too. I've seen Tadeo and Eric together sometimes, and I guess they're friends. Tadeo says he cuts Eric's lawn and that he can cut mine too, but I've never seen Tadeo do anything. Plus, for God's sake, can't this guy just leave me alone? He keeps saying that he sees me driving by his house sometimes. Yes, there are only 2 ways to leave the street, and the shorter route goes past his house, so I've driven by there by default. But I won't do it anymore, never again. I'll take the long way, even if it kills me. I reject his help over and over again. I start avoiding being outside at all costs. I get my daughter to the car as quickly as possible, bring the groceries into the house as quickly as possible, but even then he can see me from his house, and as I rush toward the door, I sometimes hear a loud whistle and then see Tadeo waving at me. I usually pretend I don't see or hear him, and I double lock the door as quickly as possible. At some point in the days or weeks that follow, I order a pizza. When the doorbell rings, I answer immediately. For one confusing second, I can't understand why my delivery guy is shirtless, but it's not the delivery guy, it's Tadeo. He's huge, a real bear, and he's sweating a bit as he leans against the door frame. He pushes a piece of paper into my hand and explains that it's his phone number. He asks again if I have a boyfriend yet. At this point, I'm desperate, and I feel like it's a bad idea to just tell him I'm a lesbian. For one thing, I feel like that wouldn't deter him. In fact, I feel like it might make him angry and make me a target for something even worse. And I could become a target for the whole neighborhood, which sounds extreme. But in the first year I lived here, a guy got beaten up right on the street. He wasn't gay, and it's a longer story, but I've always known that violence isn't an impossibility. Plus, I don't have a girlfriend. It's just my daughter and me all the time. I just needed this guy to leave me alone. I've never met someone who has put me so completely on edge. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it would be for him to just push me and get into the house. I could see him doing it in my head with a constant sense that he was just on the verge of moving, of lunging. So I lie to him and say, yes, I have a boyfriend, and we're very happy. Thank God for the invented heterosexuality. He smiles that dark, greasy smile and says, I haven't seen any man around here. He's watching me at my house, observing who comes and goes. This and the fact that he's trying to challenge my lie makes my skin crawl. It's like it's a game to him because he doesn't say it angrily. He says it like it's cute, like he's caught me against the wall, like I'm prey, and he knows I'm defenseless. I mean, I'm not defenseless. Even as I imagine him pushing his way into the house, I also imagine what I can use as a weapon, planning to go straight for his eyes, his nose, hit the groin. I wouldn't give up without a fight, that's for sure. I make up something stupid like my fictional boyfriend is in the military and he's away right now, but we're very happy, and I don't need the beer you're bringing for some reason. Then he throws a litany of questions about my fictional soldier boyfriend. How many trucks does he have? Is he handsome? Do I think Tadeo is handsome? Does he take care of me like Tadeo could take care of me? Tadeo is handsome. Tadeo has 2 trucks, did I know that? The last question completely freezes me and somehow makes me feel scared and even more upset. I already knew he was a nasty guy, but now he's a racist and a nasty guy. This guy just keeps getting worse and worse. I reject him again and tell him I have to go. He says, "Well, what your boyfriend doesn't know won't hurt him." I make him leave. He keeps showing up periodically for a few more years, leaving gifts on my doorstep at some point. An old doll and some toys from his garage. I think they were for my daughter, but I threw them away. It seems like it goes on forever, and I debate calling the police. I keep thinking that he's just down the street, and if I call the police, it'll become a big deal and could escalate further. What are the police going to do? They can't be here every day, and he hasn't even done anything criminal yet. I don't have any grounds to defend myself. But eventually, gradually, he leaves me alone. Thank God, I think he got a girlfriend, maybe, I don't know. All of this has happened over the past 4 or 5 years, but the last few months, maybe 12 or 18 months, have been very quiet, and I can only assume he's moved or gotten the hint or both. I've barely seen him, until about 3 weeks ago. I'm sitting on my couch late at night around 10 when I hear a noise on the sidewalk. I pause and listen, and then someone turns the doorknob. It's double locked as always, luckily. Now I'm alarmed, and the knocking on my door begins. I can't see who it is, but I know I'm not expecting visitors. The knocks become frantic, urgent, but I wait. More knocking and knocking and knocking. I think maybe it's my parents, maybe something happened to my dad who has a history of heart problems. But why wouldn't they call? Why wouldn't they shout and identify themselves? Then I hear a low male voice saying, "To hell with this." Oh God. More knocking and turning the doorknob, even banging on my window, the one right next to the door. Now I'm scared, but I also know for sure that I don't know who this is, and I'm not opening that door. It also makes me a little angry. What's wrong with you? Coming up to my sidewalk and banging on my door while I'm trying to play Animal Crossing. So I go to the door and shout through it, demanding to know who it is. He responds, "Nicole, it's me, Ronaldo Cerruti. I've got Eric's beer, let me in." Okay, my name isn't Nicole. I don't even know a Nicole, let alone a Ronaldo Cerruti. And Eric lives 2 houses down. Clearly he just has the wrong house, and this situation should be easily cleared up. "I don't know who you are," I tell him through the door. "You have the wrong house. You need to leave." But he keeps knocking on the door, insisting that he doesn't have the wrong house. "Come on, Nicole, stop playing around and just open the door. It's me, Ronaldo Cerruti. I've got Eric's beer," he shouts. Tries the door again, bangs on the window in an absolute frenzy. "My name isn't Nicole," I shout back at him. "You have the wrong house. You need to get out of here. I'm going to call the police." But he keeps shouting and banging, calling me by the wrong name, begging me to just open the door. He keeps repeating his name, his full name, Ronaldo Cerruti. "It's me, it's Ronaldo Cerruti. I've got Eric's beer. Open the door, just open the door. It's Ronaldo Cerruti." We go back and forth for what feels like forever, but it was probably only 10 minutes or less. By then, my daughter has heard the commotion and is scared. I'm not sure if he's going to escalate further, but he's definitely not listening to me, and it doesn't seem like he's going to leave. I'm scared by how he keeps begging me to just open the door, as if maybe he doesn't have the wrong house at all and is just trying to get me to come out. Tadeo also comes to mind because he and Eric are friends, remember? So although I don't want to, I call the police. I tell Ronaldo Cerruti that I've called the police, and everything goes silent for a moment. I think maybe that was enough to make him leave. I explain the situation to the operator, and they quickly send someone over. The operator asks if the man is still there, just as Ronaldo Cerruti starts banging on the door and windows again. "Yes, he's still here. I think he's confused, but he won't leave. No, I don't know him. His name is Ronaldo Cerruti. No, I don't know what he looks like. I can't see him. No, I'm not going to put my face in the window. He's still banging on the window by the door. Do you need me to look to get a description?" "God, okay." So I pull back the curtain and lift the heavy, difficult Venetian blinds, but it's completely dark, and my porch light doesn't work. All I can see is a bicycle lying on my sidewalk. I hear a woman shouting, and it's hard to understand, but it seems like she's yelling at Ronaldo Cerruti, telling him he has the wrong house. I think it might be one of my immediate neighbors, but I'm not sure. It doesn't stop him. He tells her to shut up and keeps shouting at me. It feels like an eternity passes. and the awareness that there's an intruder just on the other side of the wall is overwhelmingly surreal. I can hear him pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, talking to me and to himself. It feels like he's looking for a point of entry, but I can't say for sure. All I can do is listen. I explain everything to the operator as it happens, and it really doesn't take long for the flashing lights to appear on my street. I hear an officer calling out to Rinaldo Cerruti, and then an exchange of dialogue, but I'm still not opening that door. It's hard to make out all the words, but I clearly hear an officer say, "So why are you bothering this nice lady?" Finally, someone knocks and announces that it's one of the police officers. When I finally open the door, the officer asks me a few questions. Did he actually try to get into the house? I mean, no, but he kept trying my door like a maniac. He was looking for Eric's house, which is down the street. Yeah, I know he kept saying that. I tried to tell him he had the wrong house. Is this your bike? No. Okay, we'll make sure he leaves with it. Have a good night. I have no idea what happened after that. I don't know if they just took him to Eric's house or what. I saw him briefly standing in the headlights of the patrol car on the street, talking to another officer. Thin, haircut so short it was almost non-existent, clothes a little too big. I had never seen him before in my life. I guess they didn't arrest him. I guess he really didn't do anything criminal. But still, it took me hours to calm down and for the adrenaline to wear off. I didn't sleep. I just waited for him to come back or for something else to happen. The next morning, my daughter and I go outside and discover that one of our planters on the porch had been smashed. It was a bit old anyway and probably just got stomped on in the tumult. I left it as it was because it seemed weird to touch something related to Rinaldo Cerruti. It took me several more days to gather the remains and throw them away. It's been 3 or 4 weeks, and yesterday my daughter says, "Mom, didn't we hide our spare key under that box?" When I heard that, my soul left my body. She was right. Our old hiding spot was really high up and hard to reach, so the last time we used it, I just tucked it under that planter and forgot to move it again. But when I cleaned up the box, I never saw it. I checked the bushes in the nearby ground. I checked the entire small area of the porch and driveway. I checked and rechecked, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Now maybe it got thrown out along with the box. Maybe it was just in the bushes or grass or something, and I couldn't find it. Maybe. But I changed the locks that day just in case. To top it all off, after a long period of quiet, I was heading out to my car one day this weekend, and I heard a loud, low whistle. It was Taddeo waving at me from the street. I pretended not to see him and got into the car. There are a few other unsettling things happening that are a bit of their own story, like the teenager who lives behind me and keeps throwing random toys and household items into my yard from his second-floor apartment window. There's also the 2 times this past month that I woke up to what I'm pretty sure was someone knocking on my bedroom window in the early hours of the morning. But Rinaldo Cerruti really got to me, and has left me in a constant state of vigilance. Living practically alone breeds a certain amount of nighttime paranoia. But now I'm always fluctuating between 30 and 99% certainty that someone is in my house, or just outside my window, or both. And it doesn't help that it seems like Taddeo, who still lives just down the street, might have some involvement. Or maybe Rinaldo Cerruti was just a random drunk guy, and I'm overreacting to everything. Either way, for God's sake, Rinaldo Cerruti and Taddeo from down the street, let's never meet again. Believe it or not, I've always been the kind of person who attracts really disturbed people. I'm quite young, but I've lost count of how many times I've encountered weird individuals. However, I will always remember this story for several reasons. First, because he was my neighbor, and second, because it could have ended very badly. The first time I met him was when I moved into my current apartment. It's in a very nice house that's divided into 5 apartments. Mine was on the first floor, his on the ground floor, and I had to walk past his window to get to the front door. At first, he didn't bother me much. He seemed a bit strange, but to me everyone seemed strange. He got mad at my older brother just for walking past his window, but he was never aggressive toward me personally. Besides, I spent most of my time studying and always came home quite late. Life was pretty peaceful. I finished my studies and got my diploma. I found a really great partner and I could have had everything to be happy. I mean, if it weren't for my health, which was getting worse, nothing life-threatening, but I had to stay home instead of working. My life was pretty boring and uneventful until one day, while I was cleaning, my internet phone rang. Instead of answering, I looked out the open window and saw the neighbor staring at me. He was standing there in front of the door, motionless and somewhat menacing. I asked him if he needed anything, waited for his response, but after a long silence, he just went into his house. I heard his door close. It was really strange, but I had better things to do, so I went back to sweeping the floor. A week later, all the blinds were closed. There was an inscription on all of them, sealed. It didn't look official. Rather, it was crooked and messy writing in black marker. Once again, I let it go, as I was somewhat relieved that the strange neighbor was gone. I assumed he had been arrested or something. Once again, life was quiet, and 2 months after his disappearance, a really nice guy started living in the apartment. He was a really great guy, always smiling and willing to help. He had a shaved head like the old neighbor, but he was chubby and very friendly. Everything was going pretty well for about a year, and then things started to go downhill. And boy, did they get ugly. I usually always said hello to the neighbor. He would politely ask about my day, about my partner's day, and basically everything. However, on this particular day, he didn't greet me when I passed by his window as he usually did. Instead, he was sitting in his chair staring at me with dark eyes, following my every move. Still, I waved at him, smiling. I assumed he had just had a bad day. From then on, I always saw him during the day, sitting in the dark and looking out the window. And at night, he played heavy metal at full volume while laughing and screaming like a maniac. At this point, neither I nor any of the other neighbors could sleep. We kept calling the police, but they didn't care much about the noise. I don't know exactly when I realized that the nice neighbor was the strange neighbor, but when I did, it left a very bad taste in my mouth for some reason. Probably because I knew for sure that he had a history of violence. One day I was at a friend's house for a week. Since my partner was working, he stayed in our apartment. I was out shopping with my friend when I received a message that made me shudder. Apparently the neighbor had entered our apartment. My partner didn't realize he left the door unlocked, and the neighbor simply went up the stairs, opened our door, and walked in. I can't say exactly what happened since I wasn't there, but apparently he wanted to shave my partner's hair and eyebrows. He was completely delirious, had difficulty speaking, and was just spouting nonsense in general. My partner managed to get him out and lock the door. He was pretty amused by the whole thing. When I finally returned, things were getting worse. First, he would stop my partner and me on the street, telling us that the only reliable source of information was our toaster. Then he started cornering me. He would wait until I was almost at the door and then violently open his own. Then he would tell me that I shouldn't go out, and that I shouldn't trust anyone but him. It was pretty obvious that his mental health was deteriorating, as his speech was becoming increasingly incoherent. He would also take long pauses while looking to the side. For 2 weeks, he managed to corner me 4 times. That is, those were literally the only 4 times I went out alone during those damn 2 weeks. This was a really horrible time for me. I couldn't leave my apartment alone, I couldn't live the life I wanted, and I had to stay locked up in my place waiting for my partner. Even with precautions, I kept running into him, and the more I saw him, the more uneasy I felt. For weeks, I felt like a hostage in my own home. I should have called the police since our encounters were becoming more frequent. He would get agitated, fidget, look around, and get closer and closer to me. There was a moment when I could feel his damp breath on my skin. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified of calling the police because all our other neighbors were on vacation. I was so scared he would hurt me if I called the police. Until that day, I had to meet my boyfriend at a bar near our place. My first mistake was going out much later than my partner. I went down the stairs quietly, making no noise when I opened the door and tried to sneak away from his window. He saw me. He opened the window, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, he spoke to me clearly. "Don't go out, stay home. If you need anything, come to me or go out on Monday at 7 a.m. Terrified, I agreed and smiled at him, clutching my bag. I watched him close his window and waited for him to turn around so I could start walking away. When he saw me leaving, he shouted, "Hey, don't go to that expletive." I saw him head toward his door and I felt my blood freeze. I was nothing compared to him. I had no strength at all. I was just a quiet, sick person against a really massive man. So I ran. I ran for about 2 minutes straight to the bar, passing by pedestrians who were surely staring at me. I ran for my life and kept running until I finally saw my partner and our friends at a table. And right at that moment, I started crying. I collapsed in the chair and cried for about 3 minutes straight. Later, we all went home, our friends shielding me. My second mistake that day was convincing the others that they could go to the theater, which was only 3 houses away from the apartment, and that I would be fine since I wasn't going out. They left. It was starting to get really hot, so I opened the windows before turning on the fan. I was spending the afternoon quietly, drinking iced tea and watching some stupid videos when someone knocked on the door. I knew who it was. There was only one person who would knock on my door like that. So I knew it was the maniac neighbor. I didn't answer. I froze on the couch. The only thing I could think about was how that thin door was really the only obstacle between us. Then he started shouting. I couldn't understand everything he said. The fan drowned out much of his yelling, but I can still remember some of what he said. Devil's children, trust, open the expletive door, and then the worst of all, you're going to burn. Then there was a laugh that literally sounded like something out of a damn horror movie. It was when I heard him laugh that I really realized how alone I was, how we were the only 2 people in the entire house, how he could have just forced the door and God knows what else. I found the strength to get up, go to the bathroom and sit behind the door, and then I started crying again, trying to drown out his shouts and laughter. I sent a message to a friend who convinced me to call the police. This time they responded. I called too late. He had already returned to his apartment by the time they arrived. There were 3 polite knocks. I let them in. The maniac neighbor was trembling now. There were 5 officers, one of them on the step of another apartment. They had found some glasses partially filled with alcohol. They believed me and tried to reassure me, but at the end of the day there was nothing they could do. I just had to sit and wait, still terrified. After this, I went to the police station and filed a report. A social worker went to see the neighbor, talked to him, and apparently he swore never to bother me again. After that, it was just loud music in the middle of the night. Still, I had the lingering feeling that it wasn't over. For about 2 months, everything was fine. Until one morning when I opened my door and found a beer. The neighbor kept putting beers in front of my door for a week. It was 10 a.m., and I had just gotten out of the shower, dressed in a black t-shirt but still in my underwear, when my internet phone rang. As always, because the window was at stomach level, I stuck my head out the window. There I saw a guy who worked in an office right across from the house. He was shouting maniacally and making really wild gestures, obviously in a panic. But then I saw him. Right next to him was the crazy neighbor, now smiling. It took me a couple of seconds to realize what was happening, too worried about the neighbor's sinister expression. But then I heard it. You need to get out, the house is on fire. Then I looked in the direction of the neighbor's apartment. Sure enough, I saw thick black smoke coming out of the open windows. I just threw on some jeans and grabbed my keys. I couldn't grab my ID or even my cell phone. All I managed to take was my clothes and keys. In the hallway, I smelled the smoke, coughed a couple of times before running out. I was scared and confused. I was supposed to go to a job interview in just 30 minutes from that point, but instead, I was watching the place burn. I feared that my home would turn into nothing more than a pile of ashes. The neighbor was just there, standing with that crazy smile. He was smoking and watching the smoke while the other guy yelled at him, "See? I told you there was someone inside. I told you." I was still watching everything burn, wondering how long it would take before the fire reached my unit when someone grabbed my arm. It was a woman, one of my next-door neighbors. She grabbed me and made me sit on a bench with her. She held my hand and kept telling the neighbor not to come near me. She also gave me water and helped me contact the person I was supposed to meet for the job. But most importantly, she didn't let the neighbor get close to me at any time. She stood in front of me the whole time, doing everything she could to protect me from him. The firefighters arrived quickly along with the police. They asked basic questions like if there was gas inside, but he just scoffed and laughed at them. This maniac actually had the audacity to try to smash his glass over a police officer's head. That's when they arrested him. It was at that point that the woman let go of my hand. I was finally free of him. The fire was put out pretty quickly. Thanks to great insulation, it was really only his unit that burned. However, the carbon monoxide level was really high enough to kill someone if they stayed there. All his belongings were in front of his apartment. The neighbor was sent to a psychiatric hospital and the landlord was finally able to break the lease. One of the other neighbors told me that when they went out that morning, they saw a beer in front of my door. But when I came out because of the fire, there was nothing there. The fire was considered an accident and we haven't seen or heard from him since. Over time, little by little, I was able to go out again without fearing for my life. I could walk down the stairs more freely, and after all this time I can finally rest. But there's a little more before I finish the story. The neighbor's belongings stayed there for a long time, and every time I passed by to get to the front door, I always saw his notebooks lying around. Well, my curiosity really got the better of me. As I expected, there was a lot of nonsense written. There was also a lot of hate speech, but that wasn't really surprising coming from a guy like him. Then I found something else. It was something like a log. It was hard to decipher until everything clicked right before my eyes. For all the times people entered or left the apartments, this man kept a record of everyone's movements. I found my pages quite easily. Every day for at least 6 months, he knew when I was alone. He knew when I went shopping, how long I was gone, even how I looked when I came back. Every time I passed by his window, he noted it down. He also wrote comments that sometimes made sense and sometimes didn't. But most importantly, when the fire started, he knew I was still inside, and he knew I was the only one left. As you can imagine, knowing this completely horrified me. I closed the notebook and simply went back to my apartment. I really don't understand what the hell is wrong with this guy. I silently pray never to encounter him again. When my wife and I moved to St. Peters, Missouri, it was honestly one of the happiest moments of our lives. I've always loved St. Louis with all its French colonial architecture and its incredible cathedrals. But that's one crazy city, and I feel like a person can only take so much of that fast life before getting tired and needing to slow down. We had to wait a bit to save up and get several promotions in our respective careers, but once we were ready, we took the plunge and moved. It was like our own perfect slice of suburban paradise. The city of St. Peters was quiet, had incredible high schools, and boasted more than 20 parks. I mean, essentially, the whole place was one big park, an ocean of green compared to the concrete jungle of St. Louis. Plus, the big city was only half an hour away by car, 45 minutes in slow traffic, so it wasn't like the move was going to affect our careers in any way. We thought we had it made. Oops, we thought we had it all figured out. We thought we were living the dream, but it didn't take long before that dream turned into a nightmare, like no other that neither my wife nor I could have imagined. We lived on a street called Laura Hill, and we were pretty close to the neighbors on both sides of us. One house had a young couple with their small child, with whom we often enjoyed weekend barbecues while relaxing after the busy work week. But in the other house lived a lovely elderly retired couple. They were pretty quiet and kept to themselves. I mean, they were really old, so it wasn't like they could be out in the neighborhood being all sociable and stuff. I would have been more concerned about their well-being if it weren't for the fact that their grandson lived with them, who worked as a nurse at a local hospital. He helped with household chores and made sure they had everything they needed. I remember feeling pretty content that they had someone as attentive and caring as him to help around the house. Then one day, while driving home from work after a particularly exhausting day, I saw something lying on the road that sharply contrasted with the picturesque suburban neighborhood. Something small and furry, something covered in dark patches of dried blood, something lying lifeless by the perfectly paved street. It was a dead cat. My heart broke for the poor little animal. Whoever had run it over apparently didn't bother to stay and clean up the mess, and that not only saddened me but also made me angry. I know it might be too much to ask of some people. Maybe they were too shocked and scared to stay and face the consequences and do the right thing, but Jesus, leaving the poor little animal there for all the neighborhood kids to see is not okay. Not at all. Our house was only about 100 meters down the street, so I pulled into my driveway before grabbing a trash bag from the kitchen. I didn't even say hello to my wife while doing so she immediately knew something was wrong and followed me back to the street, where she gasped at the sight of me wrapping the poor kitten's body in the black plastic. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't going to throw it in the trash with the rest of our garbage. That little kitten was someone's pet and, I don't know, maybe they wanted to give the poor little animal a proper funeral or something. I'm an animal lover, what can I say? So I put its poor broken body in the deep freezer in our garage and waited for missing posters to appear in the neighborhood so I could break the bad news to the family. However, no missing posters appeared, so a few days later I took the little kitten's body to the local animal shelter, just trying to forget the whole thing. A few days after that, it was a warm Saturday morning, and I had just stepped out of my house to go for a morning run when I saw the neighbor's grandson getting out of his car with one of those pet carriers in his hand. I hadn't had the chance to introduce myself to him yet, so I walked across my driveway, giving him the friendliest greeting. Naturally, he returned the greeting in a friendly tone, and I asked him what he had in the pet carrier. He told me it was a new cat he had gotten on Craigslist, something for his grandparents to pet and give them a little more joy in their twilight years. I thought that was incredibly sweet of him, and without mentioning the poor cat that lost its life in the neighborhood, I told him I hoped he was planning to keep it indoors since cats can sometimes wander off and never come back home. He assured me it would definitely be an indoor cat because there was no way his grandmother would let the kitten out of her sight once she saw how cute it was. That reassured me a lot. There was no way I could face another furry friend in a trash bag, not after the last one. So I told them how lucky they were to have such a considerate grandson, and then I went off for my morning run. The next morning, the man from the younger couple on the other side of us knocked on our door and asked to speak with me. I silently prayed he wasn't about to cancel our barbecue that afternoon since it was our turn to get all the meat for the party, and I didn't want to store it all in the freezer for the following week. Not since it had been little more than a coffin for the dead cat I found on the street. He had a grave look on his face, so my mind was already set on him canceling, but the news was even worse than that. In a low voice, he asked if I could step outside with him to the road. I complied, following him outside as he asked me a similarly low-toned question. I'll try to write the conversation from memory. Did you see or hear anything strange last night? I don't think so. What kind of thing would I have heard? I don't know, like an animal attack, a cat in distress, something like that. No, man, I didn't hear anything. Why? Just come and see. Tim led me to his property, to the front yard, and over to some rose bushes that I had seen his wife lovingly prune from time to time. There, underneath them, was another mess of blood and fur, another dead cat. Only this one looked fresh, very fresh, and it had been gutted. Do you think a bobcat could have done something like this? I don't think we have bobcats this close to the city, man, but I don't know. Anything's possible, I guess, I replied, horrified and confused. But I mean, if something killed this little guy last night right here in my own front yard, wouldn't we have heard something, right? We would have heard something. I had no idea what to tell him. I know it was just a cat, but Jesus, we were both pretty freaked out by the whole situation, especially me, since this wasn't even the first time I'd seen a dead cat on Laura Hill Street in the past few weeks. We both agreed to keep our eyes and ears open for anything suspicious, and then agreed to meet up later that afternoon for the Sunday barbecue. But before my wife and I headed over to Tim's house for the barbecue, I made sure to stop by the other neighbor's house to make sure their cat was okay. A minute after I rang the doorbell, the grandmother answered, and just as I asked about the well-being of her own cat, I heard a sharp meow just a few feet behind her. The grandmother apologized and told me she would have to close the door before the little one tried to get out. I told her I completely understood, wished her a beautiful morning, and then headed back to my house. My fears diminished. The barbecue that afternoon was somewhat tense. Tim and his wife seemed a bit out of sorts, and in the end I had to tell my wife what seemed to be happening in the neighborhood. How 2 cats had been inexplicably killed and dumped in the past 2 weeks on our very street. She was extremely upset by the revelation, but honestly I'm glad I told her. Or she might not have noticed something she did a few days later. You see, my wife sometimes works from home given that her job offers her a pretty flexible schedule and she can practically make her own hours. She was in the St. Louis office one afternoon when my phone started blowing up with a barrage of text messages. They were from my wife, asking me to call her as soon as possible. And then they were about the cat killings in the neighborhood. I called her as soon as I could. She told me she had run into the neighbor's grandson, Vicente, at the local Walmart, and had approached him to make casual conversation when she noticed something on his arms. There were healed cuts all over one of his forearms, pretty nasty cuts too. She expressed concern about them as she told me they looked pretty painful, but Vicente had laughed and told her he got them at work when an elderly patient at the hospital became belligerent during some routine treatment. Her voice was shaky, a heavy mix of fear and anger as she told me she knew Vicente was lying. The cuts on his arms were from a cat's claws, how she would recognize them anywhere, since she had had a few cats as pets when she was a kid. One scratch in particular was very obvious, a set of parallel lines, and how if they were really from a violent hospital patient, they must have had the smallest hands in the whole damn universe. After that, my wife became obsessed with the idea that Vicente had something to do with the cat killings that were plaguing our neighborhood, And her fears were compounded by the fact that we had actually received a letter through our door from the local homeowners association, mentioning that several other dead cats had been found in people's yards in local parks, but that no family had reported their pet cats missing. We were like amateur detectives at that point, having determined that whoever was killing these cats wasn't just kidnapping or trapping neighborhood pets, but had to be bringing them in from somewhere else, like Craigslist. But it wasn't like we could just accuse Vicente of a series of such atrocious crimes. After all, the cat he had brought for his grandparents seemed to be alive and well, or so we thought. One afternoon, my wife was looking out the kitchen window toward the neighbor's house where Vicente lived. It was something she had started doing a lot, and I was beginning to think her obsession with him was bordering on paranoia, since all she saw him doing was routine household chores for his elderly grandparents. But this afternoon, she was doing her usual spying while I was watching the football highlights when she screamed, "Oh my God!" and ran into the kitchen. When I asked her what was going on, she told me she had just seen Vicente take out a trash bag that looked suspiciously empty, as if there was only something the size of a cat in it. I think at that moment I just wanted some certainty, so I agreed to wait until dark before heading out to the garbage bins to check out what she had seen. When night came, I made sure the coast was clear, and then snuck over to the neighbor's garbage bins to see what my wife had seen. And there it was, in a black plastic trash bag, right at the top of the bin. There was a bag that contained nothing less than a dead cat, dismembered in exactly the same way as the one our neighbor Tim had found in his front yard. It was the one he had bought on Craigslist, the cute tabby kitten I had seen behind his grandmother that day. I went to make sure it was okay. I went back inside as calmly as I could, and immediately called the police. Within an hour, a patrol car pulled up in front of Vicente's house, and my wife and I watched from a window as the police initially spoke to the grandparents before going inside to search the property. Then when we saw the police come out of the house again with Vicente's hands cuffed behind his back, my wife just lost it, running outside our house and shouting all kinds of profanities at him. Days later, it was all over the news. Vicente had been charged with 12 counts of severe animal abuse after admitting that he had used Craigslist to pick up the cats he would abuse, torture, and kill, according to statements he made to the police that night. He never intended to care for any of the cats. Instead, he wanted to strangle or drown them all in a bucket in his grandparents' backyard. That wasn't the worst of it, though, not by a long shot. Vicente admitted to the officers that he had dismembered some by removing their heads or cutting off their limbs. He would also frequently stomp on the animals' heads before removing their limbs and disposing of their remains by scattering them throughout our neighborhood in an attempt to terrorize those of us living on Laura Hill Street. The last I heard, he was being held in the St. Charles County Jail with a $50,000 bond over his head, a bond his shocked and dismayed grandparents had no intention of paying. I think what disturbs me most about the whole thing isn't so much what Vicente was doing, but how he seemed like the least likely person to do the things he did. He seemed like such a nice young man, one who gave up almost all of his time helping people in his nursing job or helping his grandparents at home. I thought Vicente was something of a saint when I first met him, but now it was all just a facade. Vicente had the devil inside him, and I'm glad we managed to figure it out before he hurt anyone else. For as long as I can remember, I always knew that my neighbor Don Pedro was hiding something. He was an older man, stern-looking and quite grumpy, but with my mother and me, he had always been extremely kind. My friends and I used to joke that Don Pedro must have been a spy or something in his youth, because no one in the neighborhood knew much about his past. Despite his gruff demeanor with others, I always thought his kindness toward us was because he found my mother attractive, which always made me feel a bit uncomfortable. Don Pedro lived alone in an old, somewhat neglected house right next to ours. His garden, though overgrown with weeds, had a nostalgic air that reflected his own aura of mystery. Every time I crossed his path, he greeted me with a tired smile and a kind gesture. His gaze, however, always seemed to have an undertone of sadness and something more, something I could never decipher. His hands, marked by the passage of time, would often tremble slightly when he spoke to us, and his voice, though firm, carried a tinge of melancholy that always made me feel a mix of curiosity and pity for him. The day Don Pedro passed away was a gray, rainy day, as if the sky itself was mourning his departure. My mother and I were among the first to find out since the mailman had found his lifeless body in the house and came running to inform us. Despite his advanced age and reserved nature, his death left a palpable void in the neighborhood. It was then that the community decided to hold his wake in his own home, as was the custom in our small town in Mexico. The wake was a somber but respectful event. The people of the neighborhood came to pay their respects, though most of them barely knew Don Pedro beyond his gruff exterior. My mother was visibly affected, making me realize how much she actually cared for him. As the afternoon wore on and the house filled with respectful murmurs and whispers, I found myself wandering through the hallways of Don Pedro's house, driven by a mix of curiosity and a strange sense of urgency. I decided to go upstairs to the second floor where his bedroom was. It was a place that had always piqued my curiosity but to which I had never had access. I climbed the wooden stairs that creaked under my feet, trying not to attract attention. When I reached his door, I slowly pushed it open and found myself in a dark, dusty room full of forgotten memories. There was an air of abandonment and sadness in the place, as if every object held an untold story. The heavy, faded curtains were partially drawn, letting in only a beam of light that illuminated specks of dust floating in the air. I began rummaging through the drawers and closets, trying to find something that would explain the mystery that had always surrounded Don Pedro. I opened the first drawer and found old letters tied with a faded string, all addressed to different people whose names I didn't recognize. There were sepia-toned photographs of places I had never seen, rural landscapes and old buildings that seemed from another time. After a few minutes of fruitless searching, my gaze landed on an old wooden box hidden under his bed. I carefully pulled it out and sat on the floor, opening it with trembling hands. Inside the box, I found a treasure trove of memories, old photos, yellow documents, and carefully preserved letters. The first photo I took out froze me in place. It was a black and white image of a young woman whom I instantly recognized. It was my maternal grandmother. The photograph showed my grandmother in her youth, with a radiant smile and eyes full of life. Surrounding her were other photos of my mother, from her childhood to her youth, all taken without her knowing. I felt a knot in my stomach as I continued to sift through the contents of the box. Every photo, every document seemed to point to a truth I had never considered possible. There were photos of my mother playing in a park on her first day of school, at her 15th birthday party. All the photos seemed to have been taken from a distance, as if the photographer had stayed hidden. I also found newspaper clippings about local events in which my mother appeared, notes about her academic progress and personal achievements. Every detail in the box showed meticulous attention and a dedication that I found incomprehensible. Finally, I found a letter addressed to my mother. I opened it carefully, knowing that what I was about to read would change our lives forever. The envelope was sealed with wax and had my mother's name written in elegant but shaky handwriting. Dear Elena, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer among you. I deeply regret not being able to be by your side as you deserved, as a true father should be. I know this is a shock to you, but I want you to know the truth. I am your father, Elena. I never had the courage to tell you in life, and for that I have carried this guilt all these years. When your mother became pregnant with you, I was an irresponsible and frightened young man. I didn't know how to handle the situation, and I left, leaving her to raise you alone. Years later, I tried to find you, but by then you had your own life, and I didn't want to intrude and cause you more pain. I decided to move close to you to protect you and take care of you from a distance, though I never had the courage to reveal the truth. I hope you can forgive me someday. I have always been proud of you, and I have regretted every moment lost. My only hope is that you can understand my reasons and find in your heart the forgiveness for a man who, though imperfect, always loved you. With eternal love, Pedro. When I finished reading the letter, I felt a mix of emotions: surprise, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. I knew I had to show this to my mother, though I feared how she might react. I walked down the stairs with the box in my hands and looked for my mother among the attendees. I found her sitting in a corner with glassy eyes and a lost expression. I handed her the letter and waited in silence while she read it. I watched as her eyes filled with tears and her expression shifted from disbelief to pain. When she finished, she looked at me with deep sadness and a faint trace of anger. I always knew he was hiding something, but I never imagined this, she said in a broken voice. My own father, and he never said anything. I hugged her as she cried, sharing her pain and confusion. The truth had come to light, but it had left a deep wound in both of us. The next day, after the burial, my mother and I decided that we couldn't continue living so close to the memory of Don Pedro. We found an apartment in the city and moved, carrying with us the painful lessons of hidden secrets and unspoken truths. Although we could never fully understand Don Pedro's reasons, we learned to move on, healing little by little. The experience taught us that sometimes the people we think we know can harbor secrets we never imagined, and that the truth, no matter how painful, always finds a way to come to light. In time, my mother managed to forgive Don Pedro, though the pain of his absence and the unspoken truth remained like a shadow in our lives. Every time I pass by our old house, I can't help but remember those days of uncertainty and revelations. I realize that despite everything, Don Pedro always wanted the best for us, even though his way of doing it was flawed. Life goes on, and so do we, carrying in our hearts the lessons learned and the memories of a man who, though imperfect, always wanted to protect us. Moving out on my own had been one of the most exciting and significant decisions of my life. My name is Marcella, and after years of saving and meticulously planning every detail, I finally bought my own house in a quiet neighborhood in a city in the United States. The thrill of having my own space, decorating it to my liking, and enjoying my independence was indescribable. The neighborhood seemed like a dream. Well-kept gardens, clean streets, and friendly neighbors who always greeted you as they passed by. Among them, one neighbor, John, stood out for his kindness and willingness to help. John was a man in his 40s, with a constant smile on his face and an attitude that radiated goodwill. On the day I moved in, he offered to help me move some heavy furniture, and later he brought me a homemade pie as a welcoming gesture. He was the kind of neighbor everyone would wish for, always ready to lend a hand and share a pleasant conversation. At first, I felt really lucky to have someone so considerate living next door, but I never imagined that this experience, which began so positively, would turn into a real nightmare. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came on an autumn afternoon. I had gone out shopping and to have coffee with a friend, enjoying a typically peaceful afternoon. When I returned home, I noticed something that unsettled me. The back door, which I always locked for security, was slightly ajar. I thought that maybe I had forgotten to close it properly in the morning rush, so I didn't give it much thought at the time. I carefully closed the door and started putting away my groceries, trying to ignore the unease that was starting to build inside me. However, after a while, I began to hear strange noises. They were subtle sounds, like someone moving around inside the house. My first thought was that it might be an animal trapped inside, maybe a cat or a squirrel, but the noises were too precise and rhythmic, more like footsteps than the erratic movements of an animal. I decided to check the house, starting on the ground floor. Everything seemed in order, the furniture in place, the windows closed. But the noises continued, increasing my sense of discomfort. With my heart racing, I went upstairs, checking each room thoroughly. Everything was as I had left it in the morning, with no sign of intruders or disorder. That's when I realized I hadn't checked the attic. The attic access was in the hallway on the second floor, a small panel in the ceiling that was reached with a folding ladder. Despite my growing anxiety, I knew I had to check that last place to calm myself down. I climbed the ladder carefully, trying not to make any noise, while my mind filled with terrifying thoughts. When I opened the attic panel and peeked inside, I saw something that froze me in place. In the dim light of the attic, barely illuminated by the light coming in from the hallway, was John, my kind neighbor, crouched and staring at me with a disturbing smile on his face. I couldn't help but let out a choked scream, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. Before I could react, John lunged at me with unexpected speed. Desperate, I tried to climb down the ladder as quickly as possible, but he caught up to me and pushed me. I fell to the hallway floor, hitting my arm and scraping my knee in the process. In a reflexive act, I got up and ran toward the ground floor, with John close behind me, his footsteps echoing with a menacing rhythm. I screamed for help, even though I knew my neighbors were too far away to hear me. I reached the kitchen and, in a desperate act, grabbed a knife to defend myself. John stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the weapon, raising his hands in a gesture of false calm, as if trying to reassure me. "Marcella, I just wanted to talk to you," he said, with a voice so serene it was chilling, almost mocking. "Stay away from me," I shouted, pointing the knife at him as I tried to maintain my composure. I took advantage of his hesitation to run to the living room and grab my phone. With trembling hands, I dialed 911 and tried to explain the situation as quickly as possible, my words broken by fear. John continued to approach slowly, his disturbing smile never leaving his face, making the situation even more terrifying. The police arrived within minutes, though to me it felt like endless hours. They entered with their guns drawn and ordered John to get on the ground. He didn't resist and allowed himself to be handcuffed while mumbling incoherently about how he only wanted to help and protect me. The officers asked me detailed questions, trying to understand what had happened. I told them everything I knew, from the noises to finding John in the attic, detailing each moment as precisely as possible. That's when John began to concoct an entire story about how he had heard noises in my house and thought someone had broken in, so he decided to investigate on his own to make sure I was okay. Despite the absurdity and unbelievability of his story, the police decided to take him in for dementia tests and evaluate his mental state. They assured me that he would be kept under observation in the meantime, which gave me a small sense of relief. However, to my horror the next day, John was back in his house as if nothing had happened. The police had deemed him mentally unstable but not dangerous, and allowed him to return home with a warning to stay away from me. I couldn't bear the thought of living next to someone so disturbed and dangerous, so I made the difficult decision to move to an apartment in the city. It was an exhausting and stressful process, but I eventually found a place where I felt safe and protected. Even so, the experience left a lasting mark on me. I still find myself looking over my shoulder and making sure all doors and windows are securely locked every night. I learned an invaluable lesson. A neighbor's kindness is not always what it seems. Although I'm safe now, I'll never forget that terrifying night when I discovered John's true nature and how my perception of the world changed forever.